Hello learners, my name is Nitya Rao. I'm a professor of Gender and Development at the University of East Anglia. Today we are going to talk about participatory approaches and why they are important for sustainable development. So we need to understand what is participation, why is it important, how can it contribute to improving our practice in terms of attaining development goals. So at a very basic level, participation is really about building relationships which are respectful of each other, which contribute to shared learning, to dialogue, which ultimately leads to some level of problem solving. So do take notes as I go through my presentation. Try and identify what is most relevant to you in your everyday practice. And if there are any comments and questions, we would love to hear from you in the discussion forum and carry forward this dialogue. So, what are they? What are participatory approaches? What are we going to cover in this session? It is really four things. One is what are the historical and theoretical roots? What are the dimensions of participation? What is its potential in terms of social change, in terms of attaining our development goals? But what are also the risks that we may confront? And some methods and techniques. And this last bit will also be carried forward in the next session on creative communication practices by one of my colleagues. So to start off with the historical and theoretical roots, I'll briefly take you through three broad influences in terms of activist approaches, applied anthropology, and feminist research, which have all contributed to our current theory and practice. I think the bottom line is really that it reflects a political commitment to systemic change or policy reform through a process of collaboration, of working together, of action, of learning and reflection. Now, this is very critical, and I will discuss these in little more detail. So first, to go to the history, I think the photo here is of Paulo Freire, who was a Brazilian educator, who in 1970 wrote this very famous book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. In working with poor rural people in Brazil, he pointed to the unequal power relations between the rich and the poor, between men and women, which came in the way of equal opportunities, both for learning and employment. So he therefore argued that rather than some kind of rote learning or textbook learning, the way we teach our pedagogy needs to focus on people's lived realities, asking questions about why they are what they are and in the social hierarchy, or why they are denied opportunities, and then how do we find solutions to the same. So education for him was based on processes of action, of reflection and dialogue. These three elements are very critical, and it had the potential to contribute to social change. But this pedagogy is also based on a sense of mutual respect, of recognizing the difference in power between different kinds of people, and how do we then change this power dynamic through a process of respectful dialogue. The second, really, by the 1970s, comes from anthropology and from development studies itself, that there is still a lot of poverty, there was still a lot of inequality in the 1970s, and the photo at the bottom is of Robert Chambers, who was working at that time at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex in the UK. And he said that part of the problem is that when we focus on poverty and development, we kind of don't take account of rural people's own knowledge in research. As educated people, we think that we have the answers or we have the solutions. And this needs to change if some real change has to come. So he spoke of things like putting the farmer first, of putting the last first, that as development professionals, as frontline workers, we need to respect the communities and their knowledge with whom we work. The third approach really comes from feminist research. And the basic assumption is that the way research has been conducted has usually excluded women's perspectives. They have been ignored for a long time in research processes, and therefore we need to change the way we do research if we have to make some impact and understand reality. So it challenges the top-down methods and calls for a commitment to principles of equality, reciprocity, openness to difference, etc. We recognize and acknowledge who we are and how our position can also affect our relationship with others and with communities. So this has then informed current practice. And what I would like to say in terms of current practice is that we cannot really carry on with business as usual, but we need a radical transformation in the way we work. Researchers, first of all, don't have to tell people what to do, but have to be facilitators of change. We have to dialogue with people and work together with people in order to understand what the problems are and what the solutions are. So, this is a very important change that we need to keep in mind. A second issue is that there is no one way to achieve the goals. Because we are different people, we are diverse people, we are coming from different cultures, we are in different locations. So, clearly, one pathway or one method of doing things is not going to solve our problems. We have to be open to a diversity of approaches and methods. And partly this also derives from the fact that people are diverse and they have diverse needs. So let us take the case of food or nutrition. You may have a young child, you may have a pregnant mother or woman, you may have an adolescent girl, you may have a man who is working in construction. All their needs are going to be different, and we cannot say that you have to all go in the same way. So I think this is very important to recognize the presence of different needs and of different interests. Third thing is about context specificity. As I already mentioned, that we are living in very diverse cultures and very diverse contexts. Some are in urban areas, some are in rural areas. So again, the solutions are going to be different. So we have to recognize what is the real life problem in a particular place and how do we address it. Also today, if COVID-19 is the problem, then if people want to talk about it, we have to talk about that. We cannot start with some other topic. So what is topmost in people's mind, in people's problems? That is what we need to address first. And the final point I want to make about our current practice is that this has to be not just doing something and leaving, but we have to invest in people. At the end of the process, we have to make sure that we have contributed to building the skills, the capacities, the knowledges of the local people so they can carry forward those practices. This is very essential for change. As outsiders, we can't go and all the time bring change. As I said, we have to facilitate change, but we have to make sure that we build the skills and capacities of the local people. So if I now come back to my PowerPoint, I would like to just summarize this section by saying that the key principles then so far is that we have to produce practical knowledge to take action in order to bring about social change, in order to bring about development. This needs respect for the knowledge of all participants. It needs mutual learning. It needs specific attention to the needs of the marginalized people and has to contribute to some kind of action. Collective action is at the heart of it. It cannot just be theoretical. So now I move to the second part of my presentation, which is really about the dimensions of presentation, who participates, to what degree they participate, and when they participate. As I have just said, people are not homogeneous. There are men, women, old, young, rich, poor. So who is actually participating or whose voice is being heard becomes very significant, very important when we are talking about taking action. Who is dominating the discussion? So there can be a range of stakeholders. It could be government people, directly affected individuals. Individuals can be farmers, youth, men, women. It could be organizations. It could be NGOs. We need to recognize who is participating because this will affect the outcome that we are going to achieve. Very important is to what degree do people participate? What is the depth of participation? And here we have a whole range where we very well meaning, but we may go where there may be virtually no participation. We simply inform the communities that this is what we are going to do. We give them some information and we ask them to participate or to cooperate with us. A second level may be where we are kind of consulting people. We are telling them, we are getting their views, but ultimately we are making the decisions. Then it becomes more and more higher levels of participation when we are actually involving them, maybe in the implementation, or more genuine involvement in terms of collaboration, in terms of discussion of what needs to be done, what are the priorities. And final stage of participation is really what we call as empowerment. Empowerment means that we are truly working as equals as collaborators in all parts of the process, in identifying problems, in building skills, in building capacities, in ensuring that people can carry forward what they are doing. The third element is really when do they participate, at what point in the project cycle. This is very much linked to the nature of participation or the depth of participation. That do we involve people right from the identification of problems or only when it comes to implementation, phase 2, phase 3 and so on. So here I have some example for instance, school management committees. School management committees or mothers committees. Their agenda is not decided in problem identification, but rather in terms of monitoring. So the school wants to see that it is effectively being run, the noon meal or the midday meal is being served, and they include these for monitoring, not for the planning phase. So I think this is very important to recognize when do people participate in this process. Now, I said that we will talk a little bit in the third point about the transformative potential of participatory approaches. So here I think maybe some points again I would like to raise. From what I have said so far, it is very obvious that if we are going in a dialogue mode in terms of respecting each other, then there will be disagreements, there will be different perspectives, but if we respectfully listen to each other, then we can help resolve them. We can help to, what we say, produce knowledge together, learn together, and move together in terms of some kind of collective action. The second very important transformative part of participatory approaches is that we are not bound, we are open. We are not bound by a particular narrative or a particular way of thinking. So if somebody is telling us a different story, I think we need to record it. That what is this different story? What is this counter narrative or different story actually teaching us? So if there is a widowed woman in the village, for instance, and she is saying that no, this doesn't work for me, I want something else, we need to respect that and see what we can find from that. From my own personal experience, I can tell you that I work with women in Santhal Parganas region of Jharkhand, and I was very keen at that time to work on women's land rights. And I kept saying that women should get equal land rights. And I learned from those women, from talking to them, they said that no, don't give us separate plots of land, don't give us separate rights, because what is most important for us is that we want men to feel a part of the household, to cooperate and to contribute. If everything is made separate, then men will also not contribute. So this was a totally different perspective, but I had to respect that and then work and build together in terms of how do we move forward. So having said that, there are also risks which we encounter. With participation, if we are going for dialogue, learning together, it takes time. If we don't have time and if we are searching for shortcuts, then the quality can be compromised. Secondly, many of the tools of participatory approaches are very formal in terms of diagrams, drawing, and so on. I will just talk about it in a little while, the timing and the technique. It can raise expectations which are not fulfilled. There can also be barriers. As I said, people are different. So if you are working in one language, let us say in Santhal Parganas, if I am working in Hindi, but a lot of the women did not understand Hindi, they only understood Santhali. So this can create a problem in terms of their participation. There are also ethical issues because we are doing this in public as a group activity, as group process. So supposing a woman says something about violence or says something which is not liked by somebody else, they may later on, when she goes home, there may be acts of violence or somebody may refuse to give loans in the future. So there are risks which may be encountered because of the public nature of the activity, and we cannot keep what that woman or that man said confidential because other people are also listening to it. Here, one very important aspect, which we will talk about later in our block 2 on gender roles and relations, but we know in India that women generally are more subordinate to men. Everybody is not the same. So what happens if there is a clash in perspective, whether it is of researchers in the community, whether it is of men or women, how do we then deal with it? Also, we need to be aware there are some practical constraints to the participation of women. A researcher called David Moss, who worked with the Bhil Adivasis in Gujarat, he, in a very nice paper on power, authority, and gender, he will give you the reference in the self-learning material. He spoke about that these activities are carried outside the home, they are time-consuming, Many women, especially younger women who are daughters-in-law, may not be allowed to come and participate. The language may be a barrier, and so on. Secondly, we as outsiders, if we are there, this can also influence the agenda. So I think these are some of the risks which we also need to be aware about. Robert Chambers, whom I mentioned, he also spoke in his book, Putting the Last First, about 6 types of biases that we have. The spatial bias, that when we go to a village, we tend to go to something which is roadside rather than something which is remote. I remember when I was working in a remote village in Santhal Parganas, after about 3 or 4 months, I was there, the block development officer came and then he was surprised to see me and he said, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" And I said that I have been here for the last few months, but I have also not seen you. And I think this is the constraint that even for functionaries of the block and so on, they often go to the roadside villages and not to the remote villages. Secondly, we have bias about projects, that where there are projects, where we know an NGO, we will go there, not to other areas. Person bias, we may first go when we go to a village, we talk to the sarpanch, we talk to a rich man and so on, rather than to the poorest person. There is a seasonal bias, we go when it is convenient, not during the monsoon, not when the roads are flooded. There is also what we call as a diplomatic bias, that there may be some topics which are seen as shameful. I mentioned violence. There similarly could be topics around childbirth, around menstruation, which we find it shameful to talk about. There is also a professional bias. Depending on my training, I filter information through that particular lens. Again, there is more on these biases within the self-instructional material. So please do read it further, and if you have questions, do post it on the discussion board. Very briefly, I will move to the last section, which is on methods and techniques. This is a whole toolbox called Participatory Rural Appraisal, PRA, or Rapid Rural Appraisal, RRA, which includes storytelling, interviewing. It also includes a lot of visual techniques like pictures, maps, diagrams, and so on, ranking exercises, learning by doing, exchange programs, and so on. These are focused towards developing solutions based on locally relevant criteria. So maps, we have social maps, resource maps, transact maps, which is a walk through the community to see what are the resources and so on. So this is a diagram of some examples from ICRISAT in Hyderabad, where they use a range of these maps. On the bottom left-hand corner, you can see a transact walk, a group of people walking through the village, talking about what are the resources that they have. In the top left-hand corner, there is a group of men who are trying to map out their resources. Often we do these mapping separately with men and women because their knowledge of the village or their priorities in the village may be different. So I think this is again very interesting gendered approach towards mapping. This is an example which we did in Koraput district in Odisha with tribal women with the help of Kalinga Institute of Social Sciences about a community food map. So you have a group of women and they are then mapping out various kinds of foods across different seasons. Also, many of these women got so interested in this activity that they actually brought from their homes. They collected and brought different types of grains, different kinds of roots and tubers and so on to demonstrate what was available at that time. Diagrams are seasonal calendars, daily activity charts, timelines. Here is an example from the Education for All. 1990 was the first time at the global level that there was an Education for All movement was launched. Then 2000 and 2015 now with the Sustainable Development Agenda up to 2030. And when you draw timelines, you can monitor at each stage what are the actions, what are the key moments, and what has changed or not changed. You have ranking exercises. I won't really have time, but different types of ranking exercises can also be done where we, as I said, generate local criteria to explore people's perceptions on what is important to them. Very important here is record keeping. I think that when we do these participatory exercises, we need to record the number of participants, their profile, so that we understand, as I said, who says what is their interest, and then what are our observations and thoughts in terms of biases that may have affected the activity and so on. And depending on the question, we then organize data in a disaggregated manner for different groups. So I think what this helps us is to also plan in a much more disaggregated and context specific way. And this is much more likely to achieve results when we are identifying the problems of particular groups and then addressing it as such. So just to summarize, learners, I think participation developed as a development approach, maybe as I said in the 1950s, 50 years ago. It seeks to recognize what are the unequal power relations of different kinds of people and what are the problems that they face, what are their priorities, and how do we address this. And we need to be aware that while there is a lot of potential that it offers, as I said, there are also risks which we should be conscious about when we are using these participatory approaches. A range of tools and methods are available, so there is no one fixed even tool, but we can use what is appropriate in terms of our context and the people with whom we are working. So thank you very much, learners. Do look at the instruction material, and if you have any comments and questions, we will be very happy to take this forward in the discussion forum. Thanks again.